All right. Good evening, everybody. How are you this evening? Welcome to the Empire State Plaza. My name is Dan Cunningham, and I'm a Deputy Commissioner for Administration and Operations here at OGS. And on behalf of Governor Cuomo, I'd just like to welcome you to tonight's Black History Month panel discussion on the Great Migration and Albany's historic Rapp Road Community. First, I'd like to give another round of applause for Jordan Taylor. And Abdul. Mr. Taylor is from Long Island and is a resident artist at the Albany Barn, and we truly appreciate him joining us this evening and his music and his efforts to support local artists and his passion for educating people both here and in Africa. Thank you, Jordan, for everything you do. I also want to thank our members of Team OGS for putting together this great Black History Month event and exhibits here at the Plaza. Our team has done a superb job highlighting the importance of New York as a prime destination for African Americans seeking a better life and how their significant contributions have made New York the great state it is today. You really don't have to go very far to witness those accomplishments, correct? Just behind me is a wonderful painting by Alvin Loving, who is one of two African-American artists in the Empire State Plaza art collection. Down at the other end of the concourse, if you've walked down from there, you probably noticed another painting by William Williams, who's the other artist in the Plaza art collection, who was born in North Carolina in 1942 and grew up and later painted in New York. You'll also find our Black History Month exhibit just outside the Empire State Plaza Gift Center and Visitor Center, if you'd like to stop down there on your way after this evening's presentation. There's a wonderful mural there entitled Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad, and there are several mosaics from the New York State Harlem Art Collection that are on display. The Harlem Art Collection, which we're very proud to be stewards of here at OGS, was created in 1976 and contains over 1,000 works by nearly 80 artists who lived and worked in Harlem, the birthplace of the Harlem Renaissance, which was a direct result, by the way, of the Great Migration. So you're going to hear a lot about that over the course of the next few minutes. Looking at the list of those who are participating in tonight's event, I think we're all about to hear some fascinating words and get some good discussion about the Great Migration and the historic Rapp Road community. I also want to thank our sponsors for this evening, Mildred Ellie, my colleagues at the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, and the New York State Museum for their support. I'd now like to introduce our Master of Ceremonies, who's going to do a much better job of organizing this event and moving it along than I am. Paul Grondahl is a former Albany Times Union staff writer and award-winning journalist. And I want to congratulate him on being named as the new director of the Writers Institute at the University of Albany. Congratulations, Paul. So please join me in welcoming Paul Grondahl.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner Cunningham. And it's really nice to see some familiar faces and some friends here. Thanks for coming out tonight. In a minute, I will introduce our panelists and our moderator, but my job is to really put this in context. I wanted to start with a shameless self-promotion, though, for the New York State Writers Institute, since I'm now a state employee and a University of Albany employee. I'm very excited to be the director. Since 1983, the Writers Institute has presented hundreds of lectures, panel discussions, readings, classic movies, and writing workshops with visiting writers from around the world. For instance, on April 4th, I don't know if you've seen the schedule, we'll host Supreme Court Associate Justice Sonia Sotomayor on campus. Most of our events are held on the Uptown campus, some here on the downtown campus at Page Hall. But it's my mission, and one of the things that I'm really excited about, to bring these brilliant writers out into our communities, particularly particularly our communities of color here in Albany, Schenectady, Troy, and the greater capital region. So you'll see our events listed on our website and Times Union, and hope you'll join us at those events. Now to move on to the topic for tonight, the Great Migration. There's been nothing like it in American history. It represents the largest internal relocation in the United States history. Between 1910 and 1970, so think of that, I was born in that time frame, I'm sure many of you were too. More than 6 million African Americans moved out of the agrarian southern states into industrialized cities in the Northeast, including 1 million right here in New York State, 1 million in New York State alone, and then into the Midwest and out to Western states. That is a lot of people. Put that in perspective, it would be like today's populations of all these cities, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Boston, Detroit, and Chicago, just packing up and moving. I mean, imagine the scale of disruption upon the economies, the social orders, the family networks, both in the places they'd left behind and the places where they moved to. There were actually two distinct phases to this Great Migration. First, 1910 to 1930. Came from primarily 14 states in the South, the largest numbers coming from Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, and Georgia. Nearly 70% of these black families went to large industrial northern cities, with the main destinations in descending order: New York City, Chicago, Philadelphia, St. Louis, Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Indianapolis. The movement increased the black populations in these cities by as much as 40%. And when you look at this local community, the local city of Albany, similarly, the influx of the black population was on a similar order of magnitude. And we're going to hear from some of the panelists. This rapid arrival of large numbers of blacks created tension with other ethnic groups who were already here, who had arrived somewhat earlier, in particular the Irish, Italians, Germans, and other Europeans. In the capital region in New York as a whole, the largest numbers in that first wave came here from Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Florida. So why did they decide to leave? To break away from the towns and villages where their families had probably lived for generations, leave behind everything that was familiar and comfortable and known to them. Obviously, they had to be highly motivated. There had to be a major cause for this mass relocation. Look at the situation today, and I've seen some of it firsthand when I visited Turkey a year ago. This current European migrant crisis was spurred by a bloody 5-year civil war in Syria. Has caused nearly 5 million Syrians to flee the fighting in their home country. And they've gone to Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, Iraq, Greece, ultimately across Europe, and some, in smaller numbers, to the United States. I've written about some of our first Syrian refugees here in Albany and the capital region. But unlike these Syrians who were displaced by war and really had no choice in the matter, the black families of the Great Migration left for other reasons and other purposes. First, it was a migration for economic reasons. The migrants were driven north in large numbers by poverty, lack of jobs, and the stacked deck that they had faced for generations: sharecropping, stagnant farming wages across the Deep South. The demographic shifts brought about by this diaspora were substantial and far-reaching. There was more than one impetus, though, in these phases, what were really two phases, like I said, 1910 and 1930, and then 1930 up to 1970. After the Civil War, in the first phase, and the failure of Reconstruction, blacks in the South were motivated to take a chance on the hope of a better-paying factory job in the industrial North as a way to improve the quality of life for their families. Secondly, they were drawn by that pinnacle of black culture, as has already been mentioned, the writing and the visual arts flourishing in New York City, which became known as the Harlem Renaissance. Thirdly, they'd grown disillusioned and outraged by the institutional racism and rampant discrimination that was a way of life in the Jim Crow South, where they were being terrorized during the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. Finally, these black families of the Great Migration came for reasons not unlike the Dutch colonists who sailed across that vast Atlantic Ocean in very small sailboats, by the way, if you've seen the Half Moon, very small sailboats, taking risks, leaving everything they knew behind. Why? Because they wanted to take a chance on improving the lives of their families and to have greater opportunities. So the Great Migration is not unlike all the ways of migration and immigration that have come to this state and this country. It's really seeking out and reaching for the American dream. Now, I had the pleasure of interviewing Isabel Wilkerson. I'm sure that name is familiar to some of you. In 2011, she's the author of the best-selling book that I think is the most illuminating and acclaimed history of the Great Migration ever published. It's called The Warmth of Other Suns, the epic story of America's Great Migration. Wilkerson was a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter at the New York Times, and when I interviewed her, we talked about the time she spent in Albany. She covered the legislature just up the hill across the plaza at the Capitol. And she had some really funny stories. She was from D.C. and from a southern climate, and she came up here the first winter, and she burned out the transmission in her Honda Civic because she was trying to rock it out of a snowbank, and it burned out the transmission. So she knows a thing or two about Albany. But her book was extraordinary. She interviewed over 1,200 people. She spent 15 years on researching and writing it. The Wall Street Journal called it a brilliant and stirring epic. She traced the lives in particular of 3 separate families among those 6 million. They were a movement who transformed demographics, culture, class structure, and race relations across America in profound ways that are still being studied and discussed. Wilkerson weaved together the experiences of a sharecropper's wife, a surgeon, and a farm worker as they made their way from the south to the north. She herself, together with some of our panelists who we'll meet in a moment, and some of you probably in the audience, were a product of that Great Migration. I liked her book's inscription, which reads, "To my mother and to the memory of my father, whose migration made me possible, and to the millions of others like them who dared to act upon their dreams." I also wanted to read the epigraph that Wilkerson used to open her book. It also is where she got the book's title. It's a poem from Richard Wright. It goes like this. I think this encapsulates what we'll hear and what this movement was all about. Wright wrote, "I was leaving the South to fling myself into the unknown. I was taking a part of the South to transplant in alien soil, to see if it could grow differently, if it could drink of new and cool rains, bend in strange winds, respond to the warmth of other suns, and perhaps to bloom." In terms of the narrative of Albany, a key example of the Great Migration is the story of the Rapp Road Community. We'll hear about one of the panelists' book, and there's some great background there on those panels if you didn't take a chance before you leave. It's worth taking a look at. But anyway, in 1927, this is the basic background to give you the context. In 1927, the Reverend Lewis Parson, who was a preacher and an ex-railroad worker from Shibuda, Mississippi, moved to Albany with his wife, Frances. Parson established a branch of the First Church of God in Christ here. He recruited parishioners from Shibuya to come to Albany. Most of the families he convinced to migrate settled initially in the city's south end, just down the hill, South Pearl, and the area that we know well, which has been Albany's ethnic melting pot for centuries. Many were unhappy with urban life, and they struggled to adjust. They sorely missed what they knew and loved best, which was farming in the country. To help them overcome their culture shock, Parson and William Tolliver purchased a 14-acre parcel along Rapp Road in the Pine Bush in 1930. If you've never driven by there or passed there, it's near Crossgates Mall. It's really worth taking a journey past there. And we're going to hear a lot about it in just a minute, and I'm almost finished. But they doubled the parcel actually 3 years later to 28 acres. And for that acreage, they paid $40. At the time, it was a forlorn expanse of sand dunes and open land on the outskirts of the city. Parsons sold those plots to his church members, and they dubbed it Holy Land. So we'll hear from members on the panel who've studied Rapp Road as a social historian, women who are descended from original families who settled it. I think you're in for a real treat, and I look forward to hearing your questions and a conversation that we'll hear. So I will invite the panelists up now, and I will introduce them when they come up here. First of all, our moderator is Cordell Reaves. Excellent. Cordell is Historic Interpretation and Preservation Analyst at the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. He earned a master's degree in museum studies from the Cooperstown Graduate Program, and he spearheaded a number of local Black history projects in Albany and beyond, including the Schuyler Flats Reburial Project, which was a phenomenal project. Cordell Reaves. Stephanie Woodard. All right. Stephanie Woodard is a native of Albany, the third generation of a family that migrated from the South and settled on Rapp Road. She's a trustee of the Rapp Road Historical Association. And it's nice to see all the books sold today, which I got my copy and the authors here, happy to sign it. All the proceeds go to the Rapp Road Historical Association. So I might be standing in the back and not letting you leave until you purchase a copy. We have to support our writers and the organization too. Dina Seriano Ranellucci. Dina is a native of Columbia County and the fourth generation of a family that migrated from the South and has lived along Rapp Road during those 4 generations. Marcia Mortimer. Marcia is a historian who lives in Schenectady County. She's conducted research at the Schenectady County Historical Society on the early Black community in Schenectady. She published a book on that subject titled The Early African American Presence in the City and County of Schenectady. And finally, Dr. Jennifer Lemak. Dr. Lemak is Chief Curator of History at the New York State Museum, just to our right, if you haven't been there soon. She's told me about some excellent exhibits that she's working on that are going to be opening soon. She earned her PhD in American History at the University at Albany. She's the author of the book, which is for sale, as I mentioned, Southern Life, Northern City, The History of Albany's Rapp Road Community. She's also researched and written about the impact of the Great Migration on Rochester, Syracuse, and Buffalo. Please give our panelists a round of applause. I'll collect my papers, and I know we're really looking forward to a discussion and question and answer. There is a microphone there that'll help everyone be heard when we get to that point. And I'm happy to turn things over to our moderator, Cordell Reaves.
Can all of you hear me without the mic? Oh, okay, no problem. Paul touched on a number of things that are very helpful for us here. The numbers, the idea of 6 million people. The idea of 6 million people moving, over 6 million people moving over the course of 6 decades from the South to the North, seeking a better life. One of the things that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about tonight is the sense of agency. This is a voluntary migration. These are people choosing in their own homes, at their dinner tables, in church pews, in their own living rooms to work together to say, should we go? Can we go? Do we have the capacity to go? Who is going to help us? We want to talk about the personal stories behind the numbers that make the numbers so significant, because it's those individual lives, those individual stories that we're trying to preserve and remember. So we also want to talk about some of the reasons and go deep with some of the reasons that people were choosing to leave the South. So if you look at newspapers from the period, especially black newspapers, you see the same things over again, over and over in the Sacramento Bee, in the New York Age, in the Chicago Defender. You see the same things, pleas from Southerners asking for help to come north. And one of the reasons they were seeking help is that it is so hard with the cost of living to get ahead. If you are a sharecropper or a tenant farmer, you are relying on the owner of that property to keep all of those books and accounts regarding what you owe and what you have made. So there's very little incentive for them to be honest and say, well, you're ahead. Is always a lot of incentive to keep that person in debt. And most of them recount saying, I can't get ahead. I can barely keep groceries. I can barely manage food. I can barely manage our rent. We can't get ahead. So that idea of not being able to move forward and then seeking the agency to take the risk, and it was a risk. This wasn't a set, plan where you decided you wanted to go north and everything was already set up for you. People did have assistance like cooperative economics at the Rapp Road Community. But there are many other people who came north without having a set job, hoping to find a job when they got here, hoping to find work when they got here. And many times it was the churches that stepped in and provided them with direct assistance, job placement, housing placement, because there was no agency to do any of those things. It is a church that became the mortgage lender. It is a church that became the insurer through burial ground societies, because black people couldn't necessarily get insurance all the time to even bury their families. So we want to talk about some of those individual stories tonight, and hopefully through some of your questions, go even deeper with the topic. The first thing I'd like to throw out to all of you, and it's open to all members of the panel, is what is one of the reasons that you see as the most frequently cited reason beyond economics for coming to the North?
Well, just from stories from my grandmother, physical safety. I'm spontaneous, so I'm just going to share what popped into my mind. My grandmother shared with me the major motivating factor for my family leaving Shibuya initially and relocating first in Hattiesburg. My great-grandfather, and we call it a myth, but actually it really did happen, was one of those sharecroppers, and he had a bull. And the story varies, but the bottom line is, at a particular point in time, my grandfather was said to have owed money to the family that he was working with. That being said, they came and they collected his bull. And it's further said that he went and took his bull back. And at that point, the family decided they not only had to leave, but they needed to get him out of there quickly, because at that point in time, the law was not particularly kind to black folks. Additionally, the punishable crimes were much more extreme than, say, for someone else. So that was their particular, one of their prevalent motivators for leaving Shibuya, going to Hattiesburg.
I would even go further to say that beyond the law not being fair, that many people of color had no protection under the law whatsoever. That they could not just report being, oh, I believe the owner of this land is cheating us, or we have a legal dispute. It wasn't any way for you to take your case to court without resources, without education, without a lawyer, or the ability to obtain any of these things. So I'd even go a step further there and say that they were, under threat in some ways also. Now, when they first arrived here, where are the places that they actually found work? Where was the new economic boom for them? Where are the places that they had found actual work? And I'd like to ask Marcia to actually chime in on that first.
I'm going to talk about my family because excuse me, my grandmother came up here first before her sons, and she was employed by GE, and then her sons followed her, and they were employed by GE, and for the next 30 or 40 years. What I found to be about Albany was interesting. I know you mentioned that your family was in farming, but then they had, in Albany, they had the largest machine tool facility in the United States. They were the largest producers of steel and iron in Albany, and I thought that was interesting. And it was a more metropolitan city than Schenectady and Troy. So that was interesting when I conducted research about Albany, because in Schenectady I knew it was the locomotive and General Electric, but wasn't sure. Everything you see in Albany, I'm thinking of SUNY. I'm thinking of the New York State government. So the employment opportunities in Albany were very interesting.
And just to chime in, my family came to Albany via Mobile, Alabama. They were first in Shibuya, Mississippi, and then they moved to Mobile, Alabama. And what drove them to go further was education. Both my grandparents were not educated, although I think my grandmother had more education than my grandfather, because he was a sharecropper. And I didn't learn or really begin to appreciate until later on in life how important it was for them to have all their children to be educated. My aunt graduated from SUNY Cobleskill, and I just want to let you know she's well into her 80s. So they were serious about making sure their kids got educated. And my grandfather worked at Allegheny London Steel. And the story goes, when he came to Albany and got his job, my grandmother saved the first paycheck. She never cashed the check, she saved it. And then when she thought he was about time, and those who know my grandmother, she thought it was time for him to retire, she told him, wash, go on and retire. They didn't know how long he had worked, and they were not going to give him his retirement. And what my grandmother did was she pulled out that first check, and she gave it to him and said, I think he's ready to retire. And he retired with full benefits from Allegheny London Steel.
And
On that note, we're going to take a quick.
I was going to say the common thread from what everybody's talking about is family. Migrants went to where their family and friends were. They didn't usually maybe the initial one would go to a new town, but it was a chain migration, and you would go to a place if you knew people that were already there. The Woodards came on a Greyhound bus. They didn't wait for Lewis Parson to bring them. They wanted to go see their brothers and their cousins who were already established here in Albany. And in the 1930s, Lewis Parson, who we talked about bringing the folks here in his car, was actually given a court summons by the Albany City Police. And he said, basically, I got this from, I think his cousin, Orlean Rucker. I'm not going to court. He sent Francis to court instead. And the case was never heard. So she sat in court all day, petrified, and nothing ever came of it. And the interesting thing is that the family that were already here, the new migrants that came up, they stayed with them. So Albany City was upset that, Lewis Parson is bringing these people up. They've got no jobs, they've got no place to live, but they were well taken care of. There was a plan. It wasn't just something that they woke up and decided to do. So I think the common thread there is family is a huge motivator.
And on that note, there's a video segment that we have from the Rapp Road documentary that illustrates that perfectly. So thank you for that, because that sets up the video piece perfectly. You can just play that, please.
Brought our nomination up. In the background was written the history of Rapp Road. He talked about the history of the community. And he told how this community was settled, why he thought it was significant, and the fact that it was a different type of nomination. Normally, they receive 4 to 5. We had 14 letters from state political leaders, from city political leaders, from historic groups. One of our original settlers, Mr. Van Troy, to him, to hear people stand up and talk about it, and talk about what was done, which he was an original part of. His reaction was tears in his eyes, and he said he thought he would never see this day come. He never thought that he would live to see this day.
I was born in Alabama, Evergreen, Alabama, in 1922. I left there and went to Florida, and then a little restaurant there in Miami for a while, until I met my wife, Henrietta Sheftor. And I married her in March 1942. And then her uncle asked us, do we want to come to New York? And we were so happy to come. As 2 kids, she was 18, I was 20. So she come to Hudson, and then from Hudson, we came up here to Albany. We come and we lived with Leroy Johnson for a while in 1943.
Mother Joan and them and Armand and them, they had came, and my brother had came here. They lived on Green Street. Mother Joan had a house there. See, me and Dan, and you'd be surprised, there's 12 of us grown Peace Corps in one car.
Well, we came to Albany with just our clothing, and it was 10 of us. Uncle Willie lived in the basement of 39 Duncan Avenue. Uncle Dan lived in the basement of 30 Duncan Avenue. We all went to live with Uncle Willie, and we lived there for a while. And then we moved to Herkimer Street, across from School 15. That's the school I went to when I first came to Albany.
In order for the people to remain, because once they arrived in the North, they settled in the South End, and life was very different for them there than it had been in the South. There was no farming, there were tenant homes, they were used to single dwellings. They needed something more to have to keep them here.
We had a 1-room house rented for $8 a month. And we had like the front room where you put your wood stove in for winter time, and you had the bathroom. That was it. When we came here, you lived from, whatever you could get a hold. Go to the Salvation Army and then buy stuff you could buy.
I said to my mom, I said, where's the houses that we're gonna live in? Because I was used to a house sitting in a yard with a yard around it, and here was these houses connected all along. Instead of being a one-family house, it was 3 and 4 flights, and different people lived at each flight. It wasn't a family living in a home that I was accustomed to living in.
me a job at the Tobin Packing Company. I worked there until I went in service in 1944. I stayed to come out of service in 1946. And then Deacon Caesar Moore. They was out on Rapp Road, Ella McCann, Dan McCann, Lemak, all they had property out there. I didn't. So we joined 79 Hamilton Street Church. They asked me if I want to move to the country.
They were given that opportunity by coming north with the church family's pastor. And how did you get here?
Albany with their car. 7-passenger Buick.
Whose car was it?
Ella Parsons.
Okay, so Elder Parson brought you to Albany
Yes.
in 19...
Him and his wife drove.
Where was Elder Parson from?
From Buck Turner, Mississippi. Down below Waynesboro. Down around the state line.
Okay, and your brother came to Albany with him?
Yes.
My dead papa can't be found in my brother on the county.
What was the role of the church in the community when you lived in the South End?
With Hamilton Street. That's all I know. 79 Hamilton Street. And we had a good time there.
Who was the pastor there?
Who was the pastor? First, Mr. Reverend Fall. Then when he came here, Ella Parson and my brother Jack, they were ministers then. When Ella Parson died, then Ella Wilbert took it over. And I've been shouting and dancing right there in Wilbur's Temple ever since we moved from Hamilton Street.
Parson had the foresight to purchase a tract of land from Charles Smith. And that's where the idea was born to parcel the tract of land and give church family members an opportunity to come to Rapp Road, which was very similar to the land they had left in the South.
That's when the bus didn't go on Fuller Road. We had to walk up through the pine bush, up through where Stuyvesant Plaza at now was a bean field.
That's when Mom and Dad decided they bought property out in the Pine Bush area on Rapp Road.
There's out and down to that water's edge. That's far as I care to go. There's on your mama and falling your dad.
Thank you. And one of the things you hear over and over again is this idea of, I guess you could call it cooperative economics. You have these churches, you have pastors, you have elders who are creating a situation for their congregation in terms of Rapp Road where they can recreate an entire southern community within a northern city. So I'd like to talk for a minute about this idea of cooperative economics just in a broader sense. And maybe Jennifer, you can start with just in the larger sense, is this something you see not just in Albany, but in Rochester, in Buffalo, in New York City, in Syracuse, where you have churches and maybe even also the Black press providing this economic environment and serving as a support system for new arrivals?
Yes, absolutely. And in addition to Albany, I've also looked at the Great Migration to Syracuse and Rochester, and I'm currently working on Buffalo. And a lot of times the churches were a huge help to the migrants. Over and over again, across New York State, Black churches were usually the first line of defense, if you will. But particularly in Rochester, a lot of folks came to Rochester from Sanford, Florida. In fact, by like 1960, there was a percentage, like 65% of the African-American population in Rochester had ties to Sanford, Florida, which is a huge number. And for them, the Sanford, Florida folks initially came to work in the fruit belt, which was just outside of Rochester. So they would go to the outlying towns and work on the fruit trees in the summertime, almost as migrant labor, and then go back to Florida and work on celery farms in the winter months. But when they were up here, a lot of the migrant farm camps would kind of pool their resources together and help everybody out. And then eventually folks got sick and tired of the move back and forth between Florida and Rochester, and then would eventually float in and decided to stay in Rochester. But over and over again, it was a community effort across the board.
And do you see that same type of land purchase situation that went on at Rapp Road happening anywhere else in the state, or is Rapp Road unique?
I have yet to find another Rapp Road. And what's interesting, even more interesting about Rapp Road is that Paul mentioned a lot of the African American migrants that came to Albany came from states directly south of here. So if you go and look in the census, you're going to see migrants coming here from Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And that's mostly because that's the way the railroad lines ran in a north-south direction. It's hard to get from Shibuda, Mississippi to Albany. It's not an easy trip. If you look at the census in Chicago, Chicago is filled with folks from Mississippi because that was the natural northern route. So Elder Parson claimed that God led me to Albany. And the fact that he came here, and the only reason he stayed in Albany, he originally went to Ohio because he had a sister that lived there. And then he stopped in Buffalo, said he couldn't get himself acclimated to the area, and kept coming east. And the reason why he stayed, and you folks should be telling this story, not me.
Yeah, I'll feed off of that because you're absolutely right. And it's said that God led us to Albany via Lewis Parson. And the thing that motivated him personally, physically, to leave the South was he had a mishap and received a sum of money. And it was his contention that a black man with a sum of money in Mississippi was not a good thing. So he initially left and with his wife and traveled to his sister. He didn't like it there, so he made his way east. He ended up coming to Albany for a series of church revivals, and he ended up hooking up with some women who were doing revivals and such and looking to establish a church. And because of their camaraderie, their interaction, they fell in together, and he decided, this is the place that I'm going to plant my church and I'm going to bring my folks. And that's what he did. And it's interesting because he had enough trust and belief in his people back south to believe that he could make it happen if they wanted it to happen. They had faith that if they wanted to come north and make it, he would help them do it. And I think that that really pretty much sums up our peculiar migration, because by no measure was it ordinary. And it's also rumored that he would travel, and why don't you tell the Kojic part, annually to a Kojic conference in St. Louis and for the convocation, and he would then continue south, and his pickup time in Mississippi was Saturday evening, because our folks were not expected to work on Sunday. It was well known that we attended church. We didn't do anything else, so no one would be missed. So most people that I know, their forefathers, grandmothers, grandfathers, uncles, aunts, typically left, at least what I know, Shibuda, anywhere Saturday going into Sunday morning, and by the time anyone was looking for them, they were well north by Monday or so. And that also allowed them to make that peculiar trip
So it was very unusual for African Americans to own land for probably 2/3 of the 20th century. And for Lewis Parson to get this land out in the pine bush, and when they initially moved out there, it was pine bush. There was absolutely no development. So they had to clear the land, they had to build their houses, and the fact that he sold little parcels of land and little tracts of land to his church members, that would be the only way for probably decades that those folks would be able to own property in New York State. And it was a godsend.
And was that always the plan? Even when he got to Ohio, when he was moving to Buffalo, was that always in the back of his mind that he was going to acquire this land and then parcel it out to his church members?
No, it's a contention, as far as I know, that he was spirit-led, that God led him to where he ended up, and that the plan was revealed as it needed to be. So he found it, and then he got it, and then he brought his people here and helped them keep it.
And you also have to understand, and Jennifer writes a lot about this in her book, that when they settled in the South End, it was as if it was exactly what Dina's grandmother said. They were not used to houses being together. They wanted to know, how could people be in a house together but couldn't go between the houses? And also, there was prostitution, there was gambling, there was a lot of stuff going on in the South End that when they got there, they were nervous, they were scared for their family, and some people came up without their family. So they could have easily said, this isn't for me, I'm gonna go back south. But Lewis Parsons had the vision to say, wait a minute, we can do this. And when he bought that property, I don't think it was something he always intended to do. I think he did it so that people could stay, and that it could stay a part of the church, and the church could flourish, and people would come and move their families. And it's like Jennifer said, they came with families, some without their spouse, some with their spouse, some with one child, no children, and they built homes. And as if I had gotten my house built, then I would turn around and help someone else build their houses. And that's just how they did it out in Rapp Road. But I don't think it was ever his intent to be a property owner and, sell land to people. I think he did it so that people could just, stay.
That touches on an interesting point, though. The environment in the South End when they arrived was very different than the environment they left. So this idea of not just bringing, your things with you as you're seeking this new life, but you're also bringing Southern culture with you as you're seeking a new life. We don't fully, I don't think, understand or recognize the impact of the Great Migration on American culture. You can look at art, you can look at music, you can look at foodways, and you can definitely look at churches. You can definitely look at a style of worship that was being brought with them, the material culture of the church, for everything from church fans to hymnals to even a particular style of singing was coming with them from the South into the North. So is that part of this also, is it this idea of trying to recreate Southern morals, Southern customs, a Southern community?
I think it was more of maintaining who they were. At no time were they ever under the contention that they were going to modify who they were. They were only going to improve themselves. Additionally, and I laughed when I read it in Jennifer's book because I heard it my whole life. Moral rigor, that was their term. And I could hear people whisper it and shake their heads. She ain't got no moral rigor. That being said, one of the other things that accompanied it, and as little kids we were scared, was moral rigor and the ability to speak tongues in the church. Now, the tongue thing, I think, is kind of quieted a little bit since then, but these were people who ate, slept, drank, dressed their children, disciplined their children, cooked, farmed. Everything they did was specific. They had pride, they had integrity, and they were very, very meticulous about the way they executed things. So when they came here, they knew they had the ability to do what they wanted to do. They just had to figure out how to do it. And I think that by pooling their resources, by having elder parsons, by networking their crafts and skills and their abilities, that's what enabled them. And they were very tenacious, and they were very persevering. I mean, no matter what the task was, they would figure out a way to do it, and they would help each other. And that, I think, is the key to what allowed them to stay here. Because they knew if they could stay here, they could pursue education. They could pursue better employment. They could pursue even like political venues, because in the South that wasn't. There were so many things that were possible if they could just make it here. So that was their motivation, and they helped each other.
And would you say that the Rapp Road community actually intermingled with other migrant communities? I don't know if you've come across anything in Marcia and Schenectady. There are other migrants. In Albany, there are other migrants in different parts of the city. Was this a completely insular community that was only sort of interested in fellowshipping and living and interacting with themselves? Or were they actually engaging with other migrant communities around the city and the capital region also? And that's open to anyone.
Okay. In Schenectady, in 1930, the Stamper family came from Alabama. There were 9 of them in a car, and they came and they joined during Memorial AME Zion Church. In 1929, my grandmother, who ended up with 19 children, they relocated from the South. You know, she went to Edward Waters College, and sadly, back in the day when they were educated, she got her degree in 1919, her bachelor's. But because of discrimination, she and my grandfather worked as a maid and a butler, and they eventually migrated to Schenectady. But, you know, and they went to the church. The church was always involved. The church was there for them. So they became members of Duryea up until their deaths. But that's what it bound them together, the Stamper family and the Toland family together, the church.
I know personally that all of my family members, Rapp Road, there was always a sense of unity between the uncles, my Uncle Willie McCann, Dan McCann. So Uncle Willie was like the guy who had the nice house with the perfect bricks. Uncle Dan was across the way with the pigs and junk and dogs everywhere. My grandmother, Leola, great-grandmother, was somewhere in between. But one thing I know is they never deviated from their church values and that moral rigor. That being said, everyone was welcome. When you walked into any of their homes, there was always chicken on the stove, a pot of rice, something, anything. There was always some unending amount of food available. I don't know where that food came from. I don't know how it lasted, but if one person walked in the door of 20, and this is really, I'm dead serious, this is how they rolled. There were friends of every ethnic background. It wasn't exclusive to the black church, Rapp Road. And I think that our family was almost like a vortex. They kind of suck people in and then convert them. Yeah. So at the end, immigrants, non-immigrants, different ethnic backgrounds, I'm a product of one, they just all melded. So there was no separation. They embraced anyone who wanted to worship the Lord and better themselves and better their families. And they networked and they pooled with anyone who wanted to.
It's interesting that you mentioned different ethnic groups. We always think of the story of the Great Migration being something that is purely about African Americans and the movement of African Americans. Could you talk a bit more about that, about the contact that you're having with different communities? Yeah. Are these communities on the border of Rapp Road? Are these communities invited within the Rapp Road? Just talk about those friendships and connections.
Well, I know my grandfather, Ted Woodard, he married into the McCanns. The McCanns were the lot that came from, that was the core, and he married in. His best friend was Mr. Brownie. Mr. Brownie was an Indian man. And it's never been clarified exactly what type of Indian man he was or where he was from. But it's said that he came from like the Virginia area. And his folks, he ended up coming from down south up. They were the crazy folks that would climb trees with spikes on way high up and cut them, and they were steel workers. And they kind of paralleled and tagged along with the Black migration. And my grandfather and Mr. Browning were best friends until they died. Mr. Browning had friends and family of similar like to his ethnic background that also came up from, like, I want to say, I almost believe it was like West Virginia, Pennsylvania, like southern Pennsylvania area. So although they weren't in the deep South, they also kind of made the migration with the Great Migration movement.
And it's like Dina said, with our family, they are kind of like a vortex. I mean, if you come out to Rapp Road during our family reunion, everyone is welcome. And even as we go around and we do these speaking engagements, and unfortunately Dina's mother can't be here, you will often hear her say, well, come on out to our family reunion. And they'll say, but I'm not family. But
Yes,
no,
you are.
Yes, you are. Just come on out to the family.
Well,
Jennifer has been
sucked me
inducted.
right in.
And Jennifer's children have been inducted.
Jennifer's children were raised on their first generation Rapp Road.
Yes, they are. And so it's like what Dina said, we never segregate ourselves other than to do what was morally right. And there are stories of how they would pray during the middle of the day.
Yeah.
And because the church, Wilburn Temple Church of God in Christ, now is on J Street, the original was on Herkimer, I think, like Brother Lebar indicated, they couldn't get downtown to worship. So they had a house out on Rapp Road where they would walk to every day to pray. And they didn't say, oh, you can't come in and pray. Anyone could come and anyone could come and live. We had another one of our oldest relatives, he passed recently, and one of his childhood friends came to speak. And it was just so moving to hear the words and what he had to say about their childhood together, and him being Jewish, and I cannot think of his name, it just escapes me, being from the Pentecostal church. And if you notice that some of the churches in the city of Albany, 2 of the Pentecostal churches were temples at one time. So we were very always inclusive. It was just that they could not deal with all what was going on in the South End. So it wasn't as if they moved out to get away from people. They moved to get away from what was going on in the South End. They could not deal with that.
And the photo on top of that, the Southern Life Northern City, the photo is actually a baptism of William Wilborn giving a baptism in the Hudson River in like 1955. I think that's the perfect image to talk about these folks bringing their culture to Albany. In fact, that was one of the images the first time I ever heard about the Rapp Road Community. I saw that image and it just sucked me in because I could not get over the fact that that was the Hudson River. Blew my mind. They used to do the baptisms on the Rensselaer side because they told me it was shallow on that side.
And they would walk. They would walk across
See, that
the
still
bridge.
blows my mind.
Yeah.
So I love that image.
And is this happening in other parts of the state also, where you have different ethnic groups with migrant African Americans interacting, intermingling, having social contact with each other? Have you come across that at all?
I haven't, but that doesn't mean that it hasn't happened. I'm sure it.
Well, I mean, it is thought, and it has been thought for a long time. I forget who said it, that Sunday morning at noon is one of the most segregated times in America, right? So the idea that this community was having contact with other communities, especially immigrant communities, that you would always think about there being so much friction. There's not. There's camaraderie, there's brotherhood, there's sisterhood. People are interacting with each other, engaging with one another. So that's something I think is amazing and notable. One of the other things that makes this community so unique.
It is. Because our church was established in 1837 because we were being discriminated against. Some of the people from Schenectady moved to Israel AME Church, but because we were discriminated against in the Reformed Church, a young minister, Isaac Grote-Derye, bought property for us, and we were able to build our own church. And we stayed with the First Reformed Church until 1894, when we wanted to be part of the Black Church, and we ended up going with the Genesee Convention of the AME Zion Church. But you want to be comfortable, and sadly we weren't comfortable. we were still discriminated against. So you all are so blessed. You were blessed.
And also, when churches, when African Americans were coming to the Capital District and they were building their churches, because all the churches started as storefronts.
Storefront churches,
They were just
right.
storefront. And, you know, it was the Jewish community that came out and said, we're moving here. Would you like to buy our property? If it hadn't been for the Jewish community, there are 3 churches in the city of Albany that were once synagogues, and now they're very large congregation of people. So I think it was always there. It just, I think it's like anything, it's your comfort zone. I have just one story to share. I was working at the Division of Budget a long time ago and went to a meeting up at Department of Labor, and we were working on this really hard project. And it required me to keep going up and keep going up. It must have been like the 3rd visit, 3rd meeting. This guy comes to me, big Italian guy, and he just says, just come here for a minute. And I had only been working there probably maybe 2 years, I don't even know. And I'm like, oh God, what did I do wrong? And he says to me, he says, are you related to the Woodards that lived on the south end of Albany? And first I was like, oh God, what did my family do? Because we're just that kind of people, right, Dina? So I said, oh God. And I said, yeah, why, what's up? He goes, you're related to Charles Woodard? And I said, yeah, that's my great uncle. And then we got to talking. As a kid, he would go to the storefront church and sit outside the church to hear the sermon. He was Catholic, and after the Mass was over, him and his brother would go and sit and listen to the music and listen to the sermon. And they would say, man, he's going to tear it up today. And we shared this story throughout this whole entire project. And he said, oh, I have another story to tell. I got another story to tell. But I think we were just always a family of inviting. It was never one of those, you know, like a segregation. It was really just we came and we settled.
Well, I touched on that fleetingly a while ago. My father grew up in the South End, and he's 100% Italian. And Italians and blacks really did not mingle during that time. Well, my father did, because he liked soul food, and he liked church, and they were Roman Catholic. When my parents got together, which was a scandal, he remained Catholic, and my mother was a member of Wilburn Temple, and my father didn't go to church anyway. So she's like, how can you be a Catholic and you don't go to church? At least I go to church. So one Sunday, he decided, I'm going to fix her. I'm going to go to church, and I'm going to be there before her because she's always late. So he got up and he said, I'm going somewhere, and he left. Well, we get to church late, and he's there, and he had the Holy Ghost. I never saw my father like that before. He loved the music, and I think at that time it was still Artist Kitchen and a kitchenette. Anywho,
Amen.
my father got up in the church line and received the Lord, and it was a wrap. And once he got downstairs and had chicken dinner, that was a deal. That was a deal sealer. But I've seen this occur every and often times. Once you get in and you're with us, it's like a contagion. And that's what happened personally in my background. And my father was really Italian, and he was really, really Italian acting, and he hung out on Rapp Road, and you couldn't tell him that he didn't belong there. You just couldn't. So he was received and he was embraced. Sometimes they had to, you know, kind of rein him back in, but and he did, and that's how it worked.
Now, Dina, I'd like to go back to something that you mentioned a while back about, you know, needing to leave the South on a Saturday night so people didn't know you were missing. This idea of people not knowing that you're missing. Do you feel that people were under threat not to leave? That they were perhaps being threatened not to leave? Because you see, in some accounts, you have agents for different railroads, different companies going into the South, talking to people about employment. And this is something that Southern landowners wanted to put a stop to. They were losing their labor force to better jobs in the North. So some towns even went as far as to institute laws. So one town said, you know, you have to, if you're going to be a Northern labor agent, you have to pay I think it was $2,500 for a license, plus you have to have recommendations from 3 different business owners, plus you have recommendations from 5 different ministers. I mean, they tried to make it almost impossible to actually function openly and recruit. So is that something that you ran into or that the people needed to avoid in this instance?
I know personally, just again from stories and just other resources that just kind of popped into my mind here and there through reading. I know that in my family's case, it was not a good thing to stay. It was almost like a death wish because it was coming. That being said, I think that the promise of employment was a lure, but it was pretty much known that at that time, most of the folks that were employed in my family were the women. They were domestic help, okay? And they were the breadwinners because they had consistent work. The men in the family, if they had a real tangible trade and had some ins with certain companies or industries, like I know a lot of folks ended up on the at the port of Albany. I know Tobin's, but those weren't really trades. They were more like industry working. But as time went on, and it was mostly post-war, the men got more consistent, stable employment, and those floodgates opened. But going back to your question, I don't really think per se that the motivation for the business agents and the employment was really the spearhead for us. I think that the idea of having family and church was the motivation, and their faith in God, because God always came first, did then, does now. That being said, the faith was the thing that let them know we will get a job. We don't need a business agent. We don't need the man in the moon. We're going to do our thing. We're going to have faith in God, and we'll end up where we need to be. But they knew they had to get out of where they were, irregardless of employment opportunity or not.
And for my family, my grandparents, my grandmother always owned land and property. We can see that lineage. It's documented. But she married a man who was a sharecropper. He was a sharecropper, and for that she took on her husband's debt. So when it came to leaving Shibuda, Mississippi, they had no choice but to leave at night to get to Mobile, because being a sharecropper, that meant you had debt, and you brought that debt with you, which meant you were then a criminal because you haven't paid back your debt. So you're a criminal.
And they stacked the books is the term my grandmother always referred to. And they were so industrious and prosperous that not sometimes, but oftentimes, all times, they did so well that other people in the community, black, white, blue, green, would come to them and seek their resources or their skills. And in my family particularly, their books were always stacked. Which meant that the landowner would say that they owed more in regard to, say, seed purchasing, or the crop did not produce as much. And I think that you see a larger majority of people leaving when the boll weevil epidemic happened, because it basically wiped out so many crops that no one could really survive it. So I think that was at the kind of put more momentum into the farmers leaving. And at that point, I don't really think that they were looking at business agents or the like for employment. I think that they just knew, between the law, the lack of political voice, poor education, the stacking of books, they knew they had, and then finally, like if you were a sharecropper, that the boll weevil epidemic, where crops were literally destroyed, no one made any money, so there was no stacking of books or anything else. They knew they had to either sink or swim, and so they left.
You mentioned employment. In 1940s, 20% of the men worked in the railroad and transportation industry and 16% in manufacturing. So were there many that worked at the Port of Albany when they arrived?
I know my family migrated late 30s, late 20s, 30s time frame. And I know that they would go down to the port for day work, and certain people would get picked. So there was no continuity in the employment. I also know that there's a couple of stories about persistence, you know, just constantly showing up at the same place and saying, here I am, I want to work, here I am, I want to work, here I am. And I mean, they were tenacious, and that's what they did. But again, the breadwinners were the women, so much so that, you know, and not to say that the men were not, but I think it was a little bit harder, even though we made it up north. I think it was a little easier for black women to be accepted in society and in employment as opposed to men, and that kind of matriculated as time went on, post-war time. But my great-grandmother worked at the Water Fleet Arsenal. They employed a lot of women during the war. So that kind of was the segue for more substantial position employment. And then after the war, I think the floodgates opened for industrial work for both men and women.
And Jennifer, do you see that trend taking place across the state as you move across the state?
Across the whole Northeast. And that really is what spurs the Great Migration, is the start of World War I. European immigration was kind of closed, and northern industries needed to fill positions. So for the first time on a large scale, they started hiring African Americans. And you can see different swells of migrants come north with World War I and then again with World War II. So, yes.
And we're talking about a major difference in your quality of life. So imagine you have your salary for a month, and you go from making your monthly salary to making that same amount of money, if not more, within a single week. That was the jump that a lot of people took in income. So, I mean, imagine what that would do to your individual life right now if you're making your monthly salary in a week. You know, and if you have greater access to education, greater access to buying choices, a higher standard of housing stock that you can afford now, imagine what that does for your family. So this is not just a matter of, okay, I'm in debt and now I can make a regular salary. It's you're in debt and then you go from that to making a much larger salary and have the capacity to buy things that you never had the capacity to buy before. You know, store-bought clothes, books, things you want in your household, housewares. So there's a ripple effect here, not just in, you know, being able to make ends meet, but being able to live at a much better quality of life that you have, you know, experiencing as a migrant coming into the north.
I was going to say, although, and I don't want to be a downer here, but it was incredibly difficult for migrants when they came to northern cities because they were relegated to the worst areas of the city. In Albany, they were only allowed to live in the South End and then eventually in Arbor Hill. And that was because that was where the new people who came to town had to live. Same thing with Rochester, Buffalo. There were only specific places you could live, and if you tried to break out of that little ward or two, you just met a brick wall. So there was a lot of discrimination here in the north. It was just a little different.
And who's enforcing that? Who's actually enforcing people being relegated to those areas? Is it the municipality? Is it the housing agents who are, you know, landowners? You know, who's actually keeping people in the area and enforcing?
I think all of the above.
All of the above.
Yeah, and just financial resources. I mean, Elder Parson procured Rapp Road, okay, the two parcels there. Now, he had a couple of understudies. And one of them was my grandmother's cousin, Jack Johnson. He started a church in the South End and primarily stayed in the South End until further on in time. But what he did was he would go around and procure houses or flats or buildings or a garage, anything he could get his hands on, and he would make them habitable and then in turn make them available for other migrants coming up so that they would have homes. I think just the availability and the financial resources were the immediate inhibitor of where the migrants initially landed. It wasn't like, you know, they had a security deposit and a bank account where they could move uptown. They were very limited with their resources and actually the physical spaces that were available at the time.
And I think that's actually kind of a parallel to what
Yeah.
Lewis Parson did. Lewis Parson just did it out on Rapp Road, but Jack Johnson did it in the South End. He made, you know, apartments and flats available to his, you know, I'm going to guess they were, you know, his congregation.
His parish, yeah, his congregation. I mean, he was industrious, and they bounced off of each other. It wasn't like it was a segregation. It was just kind of like satellites. It was like, you know, the South End and the Rapp Road, and everybody kind of bounced off of each other. I know that they started, Jack Johnson started the first daycare in Albany when the women were working. We're talking about employment. A lot of, and I remember this because I thought it was so strange that kids would go to church to daycare. And I remember hearing all the stories, but in the early days when the women were employed, some of the men were working, some were in the war, and someone needed to take care of the children. So they started a daycare in the church, and he would go around and get the kids and bring them to church, and that's where they'd stay and be fed and taken care of and played and taught, and like that was it. That's how they did things. And so the resources were made available for that to happen. So the housing, the employment, referrals for employment were through the church. That was a huge source of employment.
And also, across the board, African Americans were relegated to specific wards, but their rents were 9 times out of 10 more than what white people would have to pay. So they would be relegated to day work and labor positions, be stuck in a specific section of the town, which usually had the worst housing stock, the oldest housing stock, and then they had to pay the most rents. And this continued in Albany well into the 1960s, and the local civil rights group, the Brothers, that was one of their major bones of contention was that the slumlords, the rents were ridiculous. So that was that was still happening in the 1960s.
And Marcia, do you see the same thing happen in Schenectady? Similar issues with housing availability for migrants?
What did GE did? They hired people of color to address the housing issue. There's down on the bottom of Hamilton Hill, Lincoln Heights was built because it was walking distance to GE. But mostly, I was surprised back in the day how they lived closer to Union College. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's where, you know, blacks, but that's how GE handled the housing issue in the, you know, the 1940s for people of color. And one of the main people they got a job as one of the African American supervisors in 1951. It took until 1951 to get a black supervisor, was James Stamper. Ann's here, and the NAACP was instrumental in ending discrimination in public housing in 1952. It took that long. I don't know how it wasn't, you know, Albany. And to eliminate discrimination in the workplace, it was in 1951. So the NAACP was so instrumental in, you know, ending segregation in the workplace and integrating. So the NAACP played a major role in Schenectady.
And do you see more of that happening as you move it into the 50s, where you have not just the churches, but also groups like the NAACP. As you move into the 60s, and groups like the Urban League, do you see them coming to the forefront and in some ways sharing the burden with churches? Are they filling that void that churches once filled for the later descendants of migrant families?
I think so, because the NAACP president was a member of Friendship Baptist Church. He was one of the first Black African-American presidents. So yeah, the church played a major role.
I think that a lot of the church members, once they got established and had different political vehicles, because up until moving north, a lot of the immigrants, the southern dwellers, had no political voice. That just was not something that occurred. So after getting here, after having a place to live, after having some employment, kind of evolving, I think that the next logical step was all these different agencies that could identify with the needs and the issues of the larger population, not just the church community, and create these groups to advocate, to find resources, and to basically complement what the church has started out doing, but take it to a bigger level to serve a larger population. Not to say that the church would not, just to say that as these agencies developed, they grew and they networked and they made resources more available. They pursued, there were different agendas for education, for housing, just a myriad of venues that were pursued to help specifically the Black immigrant that was now here, that was established, to develop an even higher level of accomplishment with greater precision, and acquire a better way of life beyond what they thought possible.
It's interesting that you use the term immigrant, because even though they were talking about a community of citizens legally, the migration and the switch in culture, the new environment, was very much akin to an immigration experience. We're going to very soon open the floor up for questions, but before we do, I'd like each of you to answer this, and I will start. I will answer it too, because I want to get in on this, because I'm also a product of the Great Migration. So my grandmother and grandfather migrated from the Carolinas, both sides of my family, my mother's father and mother, and my father's also. And my maternal grandfather was a pastor in a storefront church in Brooklyn, former sharecropper. And his push, even though he had a, I guess, 5th grade education, his insistence on reading, his insistence on books, is part of the reason I wound up going to college and graduate school. So this is part of the legacy of the Great Migration. It's the lasting legacy of transforming families, of transforming opportunity for families. So I'd like each of you to chime in. It can be personal, it can be research-based, on one story that you feel reflects the lasting legacy of the Great Migration.
Well, I have a funny story. I'm on both sides of the family. My mother's family is also they also are from the South. They also reside on Rapp Road, and my father's side of the family is from the South, but they resided down in the South End. And my grandparents' education was the key. It was right up there with God. You go to school, you go into a classroom, you sit down, you close your mouth, and you learn. So if you're familiar with the city of Albany, there's a school now it's called North Albany Academy. At one point in time, it was called School 20. You could go up that little side street of School 20 that deaded into the projects and walk from one end of that school all the way to the other end. And my grandmother used to take this walk because she would go to the grocery store. She'd have to walk out to the grocery store. So one day she was walking to the grocery store and she noticed that my Uncle Willie was outside of the classroom. And she just asked him, well, Willie, what are you doing outside the classroom? And he proceeded to tell her this story about this game they were playing in the school, and that it was his turn to be outside of the classroom. So my grandmother said, well, that doesn't make any sense, because then if you're outside the classroom, how could you be learning? And he was so persistent, well, to the point my grandmother said, and those who know my grandmother opened the door and wanted to know from the teacher why Willie was outside the classroom while the education was going on inside the classroom. And the teacher proceeded to tell her all the things he had done up until that point. Well, let's say from that day on, my Uncle Willie always went to class. He always went to school. My father always went to school. My father would pop up at School 20 when we were at School 20. He would pop up at Girls Academy when we were at Girls Academy. And when me and my sister went to college, he would pop up at college to want to make sure we were learning. So, like Cordell, is the reason why. It's the reason why. And it wasn't until we were much older, I want to say probably 5 years ago, that I appreciate this, because on my mother's side, my great aunt, two great aunts. One graduated from Prairie School, I think it was, right? Sharaka Prairie School, and she died at 101. And my mother and my other aunt, she was a school teacher during the civil rights when Martin Luther King was coming through. So it wasn't until just recently that I began to realize the importance that, people who did not have the opportunity, and my grandmother would always say, my sisters had the opportunity to go to school, but we just couldn't afford for me to go because they had to pay when they were in the South to go to school. So that's one of the legacies, I think, on both sides of the family migrating from the South that they have left for their children, is that, here in New York, and I tell my son all the time, until he went to private school, education is free. And it's all up to you to just go and get it. And now that he's in college, we tell him, keep eyes on the prize, because the only thing you have to do is just graduate. Just graduate from college. So that's, I think, the legacy that our family has left for us.
Oh, my legacy. Well, I think the legacy that ours shared, we're double cousins,
Yes, we
by
are
the way.
That's a whole nother presentation.
Yeah. I think the legacy that's been left behind started with the oral stories and the history that was before the Shubuta, Mississippi Great Migration thing. There's something about our family that takes a great sense of pride in who and what they are. That being said, that is carried down through every generation. We come from people that are God-fearing, that are proud, that want to do the right thing and will make you do the right thing. And I never really understood until the past couple of years how important it is to know who you are, to maintain who you are. And it's not just the Rapp Road community. Everybody in here has a story. Everybody comes from someone who did some great thing. That's why you're here. We like to kind of revel in it. And we pride ours, and so we were taught to fight to keep it. I never understood when I started hearing about this Jennifer. Well, who's Jennifer? Oh, this is this lady that my grandmother was always on the phone with, and my Aunt Emma was meeting, and no, we're going to go to Shubuta with Jennifer, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do... And I was like, what are they doing? They're nuts. But what I realized was my grandmother's biggest passion was constantly doing history, research. We had census, we had pictures. It was a life. I grew up under my grandmother's apron, and this was her passion. And when they got a hold of Jennifer, my Aunt Emma, and my grandmother, it was like, all right, we can do this. And the whole idea is that they did not want modern day society and encroachment to take away who we are. So I think the legacy that our family has left myself and my children and my grandchildren is that know who you are, believe in who you are, maintain who you are, and preserve who you are. If it weren't for the efforts of Jennifer, it was a paper that she wrote, yes? Mm-hmm. Initially. I believe it was your thesis, yes?
It was just a research paper.
A research paper, okay. That was the beginning of the application with some creative thought also to applying to the New York State Historic Register. Without the oral history being documented, without Jennifer's paper, the application to be even considered to be a historic site, just wasn't a possibility. Perseverance, creativity, and definitely blessings from the Lord are what got us this far. We're now our state and nationally registered as a historic site. And although it's not going to stop development, encroachment, if you will, it's going to kind of show people, hey, they came here, they were here, they're still here, and they're not going anywhere. That's our legacy. That's who we are. We will fight, we will lecture, we will put up exhibits, and we will maintain who we are because that's what we are. The sense of family and pride is, I think, the legacy that we received, and that is a gift. That's a definite gift. I saw my grandmother on the movie, and just the fact that we're able to stay and say, okay, we're going to do the next leg, even if it's writing a grant or bringing books and posters with Stephanie across the concourse. If this is where we're at, this is where we're at, and maybe 80 years from now, someone will be telling a story about us. All good, of course.
I'm Marcia Mortimer. I'm the proud descendant of Green Riddle, Lee Riddle, Gladys Taylor, James Modest, and I'm just here today. My life has been enriched learning about history. I started a fact sheet maybe 10 years ago, and it evolved into a booklet, and it's out there. But you start out a little bit about this, and you learn a little bit about this. But I am who I am today because of the rich history, because of the Ann Popes, because of the Georgetta Dixes, because of the Lee Sutton Tolan. I'm also who I am today because of God. I'm a child of the King, and he motivates me to continue to go on. And we have to tell our story. If I don't tell the story and document our history, somebody may come along and distort it. I encourage anybody, everybody in different communities to tell our story. We have a rich history, and we have got to tell our story, and we've got to chronicle it the correct way. And we have to teach our children to conduct research so they can document our history. It's so crucial to who we are. My great-great-grandfather was the son of the slave master. They kicked him out after he fought in the Union Army. But, we have so much to tell. We have such a rich history. So please share it. And please teach our children to document our history. That's the most important thing that I can do. Thank you.
So I think the greatest impact to the Great Migration is basically everything these ladies have talked about tonight, their stories. The Rapp Road folks in particular know how to tell a good story. They kept me coming back for years, and they still keep me coming back for years. And these stories are across the state. They're everywhere. And we didn't even talk about African Americans moving up the Hudson Valley to work in brickyards, but it's the local history that matters. And I think that's the legacy, it matters.
You've been a really wonderful and attentive audience. I think the panelists will stick around afterwards. We have Marcia's and Jennifer's book for sale back there. And this was an education for me. These stories were beautiful. I felt a little bit like your grandfather standing outside. I think they tore it up tonight. Yeah. But let's have a round of applause for Cordell, Stephanie, Dina, Marcia, and Jennifer. And we've got another week for Black History Month, so keep the stories and remember where you came from. Thanks for coming tonight.
So at this time, we're going to take a few questions from the audience. If you have a question, there's a mic in the center aisle, or you can just stand up and state your question. Please, go ahead.
A lot of the people who went to Rapp Road had come from an agricultural background. Were they actually able to farm the area around Rapp Road, and they were able to get food?
Absolutely. The immediate reaction to having Rapp Road was, although they were living on the south end, and I can just really say that everybody did this on Rapp Road, they started by clearing, because at the time in which they received the property, the land, the parcels, the lots, it looked like it was a horse wagon, and it was a sand road. What was interesting is that they went in and out that way for a long time, but they did clear the land. There were the scrubby pine bush pines, and the soil was loomy and sandy like down south. I've seen pictures of down south in Rapp Road, and sometimes if you're not careful and you don't look at the back, you can mix them up. But what they first did was, when they had access to Rapp Road, they cleared land, they started growing gardens, and they grew lots of food, they got livestock. So before they even started building, or they started doing anything, they would travel back and forth after work on the weekends or when they weren't working, and grow their gardens, and a lot of canning, some freezing, but mostly canning. I remember canning, and I remember a lot of livestock being raised, a lot of butchering, depending on what it was at the end of the seasons. So immediately, as soon as that land was available, everybody was out there doing something, especially gardening and livestock raising. Absolutely.
So Dina's great-grandmother and my grandmother are first cousins, and this is the way they were able to stay connected. So my grandmother did not drive. My grandfather would work at the Allegheny London Steel overnight, and then in the morning when he'd come in, she'd be all ready to go out to Rapp Road, where they call the country, and she would spend all day with her cousin during the harvesting time to bring the food in, to clean, to shuck the peas. They would do all that together. There's a picture in our slideshow of the smokehouse. So everyone always goes out to Rapp Road. They say, "What is that white building?" That's the smokehouse. So they would bring their livestock, cut, put it in the smokehouse, smoke the meat, dry the meat. They did all of this out on Rapp Road and it's in Jennifer's book. They did it for a very long time until the city shut them down. So that was, I don't know when, but it went on for a very long time. And there was also a pig farm out in Rapp Road as well, where they would get some pigs from there. So, but yes, they did farm a lot. And like Adina said, the land was very sandy, and as from our understanding, it was like that in Shibuda. So they knew how, and they knew how to manipulate their crops, manipulate the soil, so that the soil could actually, you could grow something, because at first you couldn't.
And that was a huge commitment, because if you lived in the south end of Albany and had to take the bus all the way out Western Avenue,
So like
and
Fuller
then
Road,
to
yeah.
Fuller Road, and then walk into Rapp Road and tend your garden,
And then go back home.
and then go back home. That's commitment.
Yeah.
So,
Any other questions, please?
That's a good question. We got a story.
You just repeat that one more time for anyone who didn't hear it. The question was about the schools in Albany and what was the education situation out in the Pine Bush once people started to relocate out there.
Okay, so immediately, all children had access to public education. It wasn't segregated. It wasn't exactly where it needed to be, but it was better than what they had. That being said, when everyone started finally moving into their dwellings on Rapp Road, the Albany City School District was still the school district, and it was still available. However, there was no vehicle, literally, for the children to get to school. And so my great-grandmother took it upon herself to collect the children and drive them to school. And they kind of petitioned and rallied and hemmed and hawed and pressured the school district to provide transportation for the Rapp Road community, the children. And I guess at one point it was, one of the contentions was the wagon lane that I spoke about with the agriculture, that the road was not wide enough. So my uncles went out and they widened the road, and the city of Albany provided a bus, and my grandmother drove the bus. And so, or the church, excuse me, that's right. Oh, I'm corrected, the church bought the bus, and my grandmother drove the children back and forth to school. And I believe it primarily stayed that way until Washington Avenue Extension came into existence. And once that got going, again, the floodgates opened.
And she was the first woman bus driver in the city of Albany.
Yeah. And those children attended what's now called Eagle Point. They all went to Eagle Point on Western Avenue.
Right.
Any other questions? Yes.
I grew up in Central Florida, lived in 20 miles out of the
Do you have a specific time period you're interested in? Okay, so some of my uncles were in the service, and I know that when they got out, there wasn't a very cohesive support system in regard to health needs. There really wasn't financial support as far as, I think basically once they got out, that was it. There was no money to be had. There was no, again, medical care. And the other thing that's interesting is at that point in time, there was no consideration of how the war affected the mental health. We had some individuals in our family that went through some serious changes because of the things that they saw. And instead of the government providing any type of help or assistance, again, we reverted to community, friends, and church. So I think at that point in time, no one really made out too terribly well post-war financially or with resources, but I think what resources that were out there were scant to none from what I can recall, from stories of different family members.
Housing. Yeah,
But
we know that, but still.
okay, I think that kind of parallels with the newspaper publications that the South had employment opportunities, political voices, and the lot during the Jim Crow time. What was presented, what was purported, was not had. So although they were there, to my recollection, no one that I've descended from has had any benefit from any of those available resources.
I have to agree too. You know, I think about my father and his uncle, his brother, they were in the military. But I also think back in the 1800s when Jared A. Jackson fought in the Civil War. It took him 10 to 12 years to get his pension, and he died 10 weeks later. So, you know, it hadn't changed, and
Yeah,
that's
and
the sad,
I
that's the
don't wanna
sad
go
part of our
against,
history.
You know, I don't want to slander or sound negative. I'm not as well versed as you on what you read, but I will say this: more than likely, everything that has been published, that has been said to be available, probably was. I can just say that I know that we did not benefit from anything that was on the table at the time. Well, I'll tell you, just in regard to mortgages, I'll tell you how that played out on Rapp Road. We had no mortgages. Our houses were built in stages at the end of a work day or a work week. It took time and effort and bartering on skills. It was taking so much time for my great-grandfather and my grandmother to make their house that my grandmother got sick and tired of it. And she decided to take whatever she could find that people had discarded depending on their stage of construction, and she built a shotgun house. And she made such quick, she developed such quick results that her husband stopped what he was doing and helped her finish her shotgun house, and they moved from the south end to the house so that they could save their money, so that they could buy the proper supplies, so that they could build their home. Because there were no mortgages to be had for black folks. They might have been published, they might have been advertised, but we did not have any. That's how we did it.
It was not equitable.
Correct.
No.
Another question here? Use the microphone, please.
Your family, they were kind of out in the middle of nowhere in the 40s. Did they have any harassment? Anyone trying to stop what they were doing?
Do you know that we were like a mermaid or like Atlantis or something? Like we were the thing that you might have heard about but you never saw.
Yeah.
We
Like
really did
Aborigines.
not receive any type of harassment per se until Cross Gates and the Pyramid
Washington Avenue
Corporation.
Extension is probably the first one.
Because they wanted the park.
Well, yeah, Washington Avenue Extension, but I'm talking, and she's right. No one really came out there. No one drove through our community. It was, and now it's horrific. The traffic that flies through Rapp Road is a cut across. And before, I mean, we as children would play out there and run all over to everybody's house, and there was only one rule. Don't do what you're not supposed to do and be inside before dark. Okay, those were the rules. That was it. And now, I would never let my children, well, I never did. I didn't let my children cross the road or cross the street, whatever you want to call it out there, because there's so much. But we really had no type of racial incidents or hate crimes, or there was none of that out there because we really weren't exposed to the outside world. Yeah.
Emma Dixon, who is, I don't know how she's
My
referred,
aunt.
her aunt. She's the woman who I really worked with initially quite a bit. And I remember her telling me the story about when Washington Avenue Extension went through, and that was in the 70s, right, Paul? And she just said people would drive by and see black people living out there, and their mouths would just, gape open.
They really couldn't.
Where are these people coming from?
Where did these black people come from?
And she got such a kick out of it, it made me laugh. But I don't think until that road was built, most folks outside of the community and outside of the black community probably had no idea that the folks were out there.
We're going to take one more question, please.
I don't have a question, but I could sit all night and listen to these stories, and it's just phenomenal. I mean, what a wonderful, wonderful group of strong, lazy black people. Lazy to the core, that they have been able to establish such a great community with wonderful children. Just a wonderful family. I'm just so proud to be a part of that. But I would like to know if you could squeeze out one more presentation. If you could do something for my church that I found out, Union Baptist Church.
We're not accepting solicitation at this time. Absolutely.
Do I have to pay you?
Absolutely.
Great, great, because I found out that my church is a part of the establishment, and we just celebrated 90 years.
Amen.
But I am just, I'm just filled up. I'm filled up, and like I said, I could listen to this over and over, and I have listened to it over and over, but I want to hear it some more. Thank you.
Well, there was one more, I'm sorry, one more thing.
Well, it started with Emma Dixon.
Yes.
But it did start a little before then. So when Crossgates, what was that, maybe the 80s or early 90s, wanted to double their size and expand, Emma started 89. Emma's 85. Okay, that early? Was it? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So Emma and the folks that were living out on Rapp Road would start to go to their planning meetings, and they learned everything that was going on. They talked to the planners, and they were right in step with what was going on. And if the Crossgates was going to impact the community has a presence at those meetings and said, no, people live here. You can't do that. You want to build this road, and that's my house. You can't do that. So that, I think, really kind of kick-started Emma's vision for the community of getting it on the historic district.
She also became politically savvy and utilized the local councilmen, local people, and politics are a hairy thing. But she learned how to utilize her resources as not to offend them, but have them embrace her needs. And like Jennifer said, I remember many a time she would make all of us, we'd want to go and hang out on the weekend or go to a party, and we'd have to go with Emma on Monday morning or something to, a city, some type of meeting, some type of something. So our initial legal representation started that way. That being said, if you kind of hit the fast forward button, right now, Miss Stephanie we have a lawyer. We're very cool. And we have a consulting architect. We
got media people.
Yes, we have media, social media.
Yeah, social media people.
But at this point in time, we're pursuing legal documents, legal verbiage, legal review of upcoming projects or like easements, anything. So we're really, right now as we speak, we're pursuing that venue to become not only legally represented, but we want to be active and proactive at the same way. So that's where we're at.
And there's one more question here right in the front row.
Actually, what it is, it's an appreciation for Paul Grondahl and your many, many decades of being a remarkable reporter and part of the Times Union, and wishing you just a very, very, very fast new director of writing. Thank you.
And that's a perfect segue because there are a couple of other people that we'd like to recognize in the crowd also.
Yeah, that was actually really perfect. So as me and Dina has taken this on with her mother being ill, but I don't think Dina's gonna, I think me and Dina's gonna be in for a while unless we get Paige to jump by and help us out a little bit. She's another descendant. And what we like to do when we do these speaking engagements, we like to recognize those who have supported Rapp Road and the community, who has lived it and seen it firsthand. So the first person we want to recognize Georgina Parsons, who's sitting in the back. She's descendant of so she is descendant from Lewis Parsons, and we get her father every once in a while to tag along with us. The other, I do want for people to stand. We do have descendants out in the audience this evening, and I just like for you all to stand so you can be recognized, so people can ask you questions, because you have stories to tell as well as we do. So if you can please stand, your descendant. And stay standing, stay standing. So, and most importantly, there are the folks who currently live on Rapp Road, and we do have one person, I think, in the audience who currently lives on Rapp Road. If we'd ask her to please stand. There, if she's here. Nope. Okay, I just wanted to make sure, because I don't want to leave anyone out. And last but not least, if you are a descendant from the South, wherever that South may be, we ask you to please stand. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all for attending tonight. I'd like to thank all of our panel members, OGS Special Events, and Paul Grondahl, and thank all of you for actually participating in this and being a part of preserving this important history. Have a good night.